Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on developing a national approach to managing disruption. Hopefully everyone is staying cool and has a cold drink to hand before we start today, as I know it's quite a warm one. So I'm Chloe Williams. I'm an associate and travel behaviour change lead at Arup, and I also chair the CILT Travel Demand Management Forum, and I'll be chairing today's session. So it's great to see so many of you from across the transport sector who are joining us today as two professional networks, CILT and TPS, come together to discuss this really important topic. So we know that disruption is something that we all deal with regularly, whether that's planned works, major infrastructure schemes, or unexpected events that can happen on the network. But how we manage it is often still quite fragmented. And we tend to approach disruption from a modal or an organisational perspective rather than thinking about that whole journey or the wider system. So, what we're going to explore during our time together today is how we move beyond that. So, towards a more integrated, multimodal, and potentially a more strategic approach at a national level. So, we'll be looking at the role of national guidance versus local flexibility and have some discussion around that, and also how different organisations can be better coordinated and how approaches such as travel demand management can be embedded much earlier in planning rather than brought in reactively. So in terms of the agenda for today, I'm really pleased to be joined by an excellent lineup of panel speakers representing different parts of the sector who I'm sure will bring a range of perspectives to this topic. And this will be followed by a Q&A session with the panel at the end. So please do pop any questions into the YouTube chat during the presentations, and we will come to those at that point. And so before I hand over to the first speaker, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the CILT Travel Demand Management Forum, as I mentioned, which I am the chair of. So we're really pleased to be partnering with TPS today on this event. The CILT TDM Forum is very much around raising the awareness within the wider industry of the benefits of TDM. We really enjoy forging links with other CILT forums and networks, hence the webinar today. And we really aim to promote and deliver events to advance the practice of TDM and really promote the benefits that it can bring. We also do a lot of work around highlighting and disseminating good practice through publications and events such as the one today. And we're really passionate about promoting the upskilling and education of people and inspiring people to come and join us in the fantastic world that is TDM. And as part of that, last year, we launched our 2-day training course, a practical guide to travel demand management that runs again this September, and the details of which can be found on the CILT Travel Demand Management Forum website or on PTRC. We've got over 200 members now, which is brilliant, and they're a really good representation of those across the industry, from public, private sector, education, institutes, community groups. So you are more than welcome to join us. I will hand over to my Arup colleague, Liani, who is just going to run through TPS.
Yeah, hello everyone. Very warm welcome on this very warm day from TPS. My name is Liani Baglietto. I'm a senior planner at Arup, but I'm also a board director at the TPS. And I'm just here to tell you a little bit about the Transport Planning Society and who we are. We are basically a society that is there to facilitate, develop, and promote best practice and innovation in transport planning, and to provide a focus for dialogue between all those engaged in it, whatever their background. And I think it is, if we can go to the next slide, that is quite reflective of the work that we do. For example, we have a number of initiatives that you can get involved with, including the policy panel that is here with us today. And our policy panel is composed by a number of subgroups. For example, today we have the influencing travel demand policy group that has done just an incredible think piece on influencing travel behavior. But like that group, we also have the active travel and micromobility group, the rail, bus, and freight group, the governance business cases and modeling appraisal, and the development and land use planning groups. So if any of those are of interest to you, please do reach out, and because we will be more than glad to receive more input from the industry. And here, just on the screen, there are a few of the benefits from being a member of TPS, including being able to attend these events. And if we go to the next slide, this is just a plug for our upcoming events because we are having a very, very busy summer. Today, we have the Developing a National Approach to Managing Disruption, but then we will also have tomorrow, if you are in Manchester, a lunchtime walking tour. Then we will also be having in Leeds another event at this, like on the same day, looking at transport policy in climate crisis and whether it's time for a radical rethink. That will also be live streamed. So please do join if you are free. We have a number of PDS mentor trainings, and then very importantly, we have our summer reception coming up next month, which is going to be a very big event. It's going to be taking place in Manchester in our offices on the 16th of July. And also just to announce that our bursary competition is now live. The bursary question is right there, and we will be accepting abstracts until the 17th of July. So if you know of a young professional that is very interested in doing some research and getting the potential to be mentored by a senior person in the industry, as well as receiving a prize if all goes well, please do let them know. It is a very exciting competition. There's a picture there from last year and our 5 finalists that came to London to present their research at the TfL offices. So yes, please, loads of opportunities to get engaged. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Liani. So with that, I will now hand over to our first speaker, who's Alistair Ryder. And Alistair is the Active Travel and Travel Demand Management Team Leader at National Highways. So over to yourself, Alistair.
Thank you very much. I'll just load up the presentation. Hopefully this will work in the right mode. Right, this. Now, is that working in presentation mode? Or is it the... It's not.
We can see it in presenter view. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Bear with me a second. Apologies for this. It was working a minute ago, and now, of course, it isn't. I need it to just about a second. Right. Hopefully, this will now work properly.
Yes, that's great. Yes, it has. Thanks, Alistair.
Fantastic. Right. Apologies for the slightly delayed start there. So, yeah, I'm Alistair Ryder. I work in National Highways. A bit more about National Highways in a minute. I lead the Travel Choice and Active Travel team within National Highways, which has a national role and remit. Just for context then, you're remiss of me not to explain National Highways for anyone who isn't aware. So National Highways is the company that operates and manages the strategic road network, which basically is the 4,500 miles of motorway and major A road that we have in England. We're a 24/7 operation. We have management of the motorway network and various other services that feed into that, running every day of the year. We are delivering the government's road investment strategy. So Road Investment Strategy 3 has just been published, and that includes, for example, £27 billion of investment that will be provided over the next 5 years to operate, maintain, and enhance the strategic road network. And critically, that includes £8 billion of renewals. So from the customer perspective and how the network functions and operates, that's a lot of pressure on maintaining a resilient and effective network whilst delivering these renewals programs on our network. We have 3 imperatives in National Highways, which are safety, delivery, and customer. And I guess for this presentation, the focus is very much around customer impact. I'm going to explain what we mean by that in a minute. But I think it's fair to say that how an engineering and delivery-based organisation would consider the enhancements and renewals programs. We think of the overall outcomes of achieving quality infrastructure, having quality, reliable assets. But what we also need to be aware of course, is that for our customers who are faced with challenge during disruption on our network during planned roadwork, their thoughts are often around the delays that are happening, what closures are in place, and how do we navigate transport needs and travel behaviour during those times. Also, an information awareness around when the closures are happening, what the options present to those individuals that need to travel along the network on a daily and regular basis. Unexpected disruption as well is often a key problem that can be faced in the strategic road network, whether that be things like accidents happening, or whether that may be roadworks that have gone on beyond what we were planned to achieve or be closed for on particular roads. And then we also have a series of diversions as well. So from the customer perspective, you can face a significant amount of anxiety in that space. If it's not very clearly signed, you're not sure how long or how far a diversion is lasting. So there are a number of considerations from the customer perspective that we need to bring into how we consider, plan and deliver both the scheme and any roadworks, any closures or diversions that are required around that. And for us, it's very much about building on a systems thinking approach that we, National Highways, use internally to challenge and deliver better in terms of what our customers experience and face during planned roadwork. And so what we use is something called the Customer Experience Engine. And that's really a systems piece which looks at what do we know about customer needs, and that could be around travel choice, travel opportunities, what are the customer requirements, and how do we ascertain a bit more information and understand a bit more around those pain points and opportunities for us as an organisation to help people's journeys be smoother and those regular journeys happen during periods of significant disruption. All that intelligent information and research feeds into our experience design process. So, okay, when we are looking at delivering a major scheme on our network, for example, what are the considerations we need to bring into play when we're thinking about how we manage the network and provide our customers with the best possible service we can during those periods of disruption, and then obviously through to implementation and then using intelligence and evaluation to improve the provision and bring that back around to the start process. What I just want to focus on in this presentation is around our road user and community impact assessment, which is a key part of when we are developing, designing schemes and the phase of construction on the network. So we have a tool, this road user and community impact assessment. It's a live document that all of our delivery teams use. And it really challenges designers and engineers to consider about a few different angles around the disruption that's going to be planned on the network, and then come over with an overall rating of either low, medium or high impact for certain customers that we talk of, whether that's road users, residents, businesses or communities. So programme coordination is a key consideration. Are there other high impact schemes in the area, corridor or route? And we are on a journey in that space around how wide scale, how network wide we think about impacts on different modes and abilities for residents, customers to actually have travel choice and travel options on corridors where we are delivering a major scheme. Obviously, there's the en route challenges we have around closure times, delay estimates, narrowing of lanes, things from an engineering perspective. What's that like for the customer? How does that feel as a customer traveling through those roadworks? And then diversions I've already touched on around, is it going to create significant additional journey time? What's the impact on those surrounding areas of diversion routes of putting a significant amount of SRN traffic through a diversion route? And also, what's the impact on the local stakeholders, whether that's businesses, for example, in the area, or communities along those routes? So we have this tool. It is a live document that is going through a constant check and challenge process. And should we be thinking about things in a more wider network or systems approach around the impact for our users, customers and communities? So but it is a really strong document that's used for all schemes to consider the impacts and consider the right breadth of considerations and inputs to any scheme that we're about to deliver. So what I want to just touch on briefly is one of our major schemes that happened 2 years ago, really well, finished it last year, which was the M25 Junction 10 scheme, where we actually closed one of the junctions for a number of weekends in 2024. And this was a real challenge for National Highways. And it was all about trying to raise awareness and make people ready to be able to plan ahead appropriately for that week, for the weekends of closures, consider whether there are alternative modes that were available to them, and have the information that they need to make choices around the journeys. And for us, it was a huge challenge. This is a part of the network which sees 4,000 to 6,000 vehicles every hour passing through that junction. And when we did some modelling on the potential delay and disruption from the closures, it was that there were going to be 15-hour delays if we didn't get this right. So there was an overall need to reduce traffic by about 50% of what would normally pass through that junction for those diversion routes to work effectively and the network to hold out really during those closures. So just in terms of the approach that National Highways took, it was multifaceted from a communications perspective. It was about creating a media moment, a national media moment. So being very clear that this is the first time the M25 has been closed since 1970, and having a really intelligence-based approach to communication. So one thing we found was that from doing a lot of research ahead of these closures, that customers really want information about 10 days in advance. That gives them the foresight without having it too far in advance that they forget about the closures up and coming when they arrive, but also giving people enough time scale to actually plan journeys and plan their approaches for that weekend of closure. We also recognise there's a huge network of partners that we worked with, over 200, to actually amplify the message around those closures. And with the onset of things like mobile phone technology and using things such as SatNav and other wayfinding mechanisms, we're able to target key messages to users that regularly and routinely pass through those junctions with social media presence and social media messages that were targeted. So it was a really proactive comms approach that was both informative of the closure, but we did also try and identify that people should, where possible, look at retiming and remoding journeys where possible. And there's a very proactive approach to that, rather than just providing information about the closure and letting the user decide what differences to make in their journey. We did actually try it. Now, some of the comms were really effective. Some of the comms messages seemed to land on particular slants, such as decorate the bathroom or something was the message that seemed to come through, which wasn't exactly the official line. But I think one of our project managers interviewed at the time had a long day and just thought, well, that's probably the best line to send out. And it seemed to stick. And actually, what happened with this was that there was a significant reduction in the traffic. I think it was below the 50% that we're hoping to achieve. The diversion routes actually worked effectively because the messaging and communication put out there, including our work with things like the Surrey Local Resilience Forum as well, and working with Transport for London on the comms, on the transport network, how it would cope during this closure, was a really effective example. Just briefly, we are looking at that learning from the M25, and we have a significant scheme in the northwest that is to be delivered during this third roads period, so from now until 2030, which is up in Greater Manchester, Sinister Island. And again, a really significant piece of the network that will face closures, some different scenarios of closures. It carries about 90,000 vehicles each day, ranging from short to long distance strategic trips. So we are working really hard to look at how can we provide effective transport options for users. And we're doing quite a bit of work with Transport for Greater Manchester at the minute to look at what are the opportunities for promoting, for example, park and ride facilities that are in existence around Manchester, other modes, to look at how we can remode some of those journeys. But it is a really challenging environment. We've just undertaken, just completed a user insight survey. So we've done a survey that was very much targeted at people who pass through the junction on a regular basis to ask about their travel behaviour and patterns during significant disruption from the M60 junction scheme. And so, in my mind, an ideal scenario would be to maybe see how we work as a transport system to see, is there an ability to move some of those journeys during some of these planned closures onto other modes? And part of the survey did ask around people's potential habits during the closures. And that's a really challenging space because sometimes people, for various reasons, need to undertake journeys by car. And actually in the survey, when we asked people about how would they potentially travel differently during that, during those closures, a very small proportion of people actually said they would look at a different mode. 1% of the 2,000 odd responses would actually look at changing mode. More people would look at actually continuing using the junction either as normal or via the diversion routes. And a high proportion would also look at maybe relying on their wayfinding app to actually tell them which is an alternative route to use rather than perhaps the prescribed diversion route. So there are a number of challenges we face in what be an optimum ideal outcome versus, the choices that customers have to face and the journeys they need to make. So, as I say, we are taking a lot of the learning from the M25 scheme and actually seeing how can we work with partners such as Transport for Greater Manchester to try and offer an improved or as good as we can get transport solution or set choices for customers during the phase of closure when that scheme happens during this next roads period. So that's really a brief overview of a scheme that we've delivered that's gone really well with the M25 closures and how we're going to use some of that information and evidence, especially things like social media awareness, and working with partners such as we did with London with Transport for London, working with Transport for Greater Manchester in this scenario to create hopefully what will be the least potential disruption and delay we can cause through these roadworks. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alistair. Thank you for that overview and insight. So it moves us on to our next presentation and our next speaker, who is Helen Wrigley, who is Senior Lead for Travel Demand Management at Transport for London. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Chloe. And Liana, you're very kindly going to share my slides for me because TfL Tech has failed this morning in the heat. So I will let you know when I need to move on. In fact, let's move on to the first slide there. So a brief introduction from me. As Chloe mentioned, I'm Helen Wrigley. I work in Transport for London's Travel Demand Management team and have since 2012. And today I'd like to talk to you about a particular case study of quite a complex TDM project that's still in delivery, but it provides a really useful example of how TDM can work in the London context. But before I get to that, I want to just tell you a little bit about travel demand management at Transport for London and about us as a team. So we're quite a small team. There's only 17 or 18 of us at the moment. And as a team, we've existed since the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games, where I'm sure many of you are familiar with the successful travel demand management campaign, Get Ahead of the Games, which was run to mitigate the impacts of all of that additional demand in London across that period. And in its post-game TfL format, travel demand management at TfL has continue to respond to those multiple large-scale events, so Tour de France, Rugby World Cup, Football World Cups, etc., a whole suite of royal events that happened in recent years, and also those major closures, like a full closure of a branch of the Northern Line in recent years. But we've evolved somewhat, so our remit has broadened to address the real challenge that we face around everyday crowding and congestion on our network, and how we can use behaviour change to enable smarter and more sustainable travel choices, making sure that we're spreading demand across time and routes and modes for more comfortable journeys, because I'm sure we're all acutely aware that comfort is becoming a really important factor in journey choices and journey planning post-pandemic. So that's led us to kind of engagement with freight industries and businesses to encourage consolidation and retiming, and for businesses and employers, that kind of modal shift that enables less crowded journeys. We also broadened again in our remit, evolved, as some might say, to apply our practice that we use for planned works and events to those kind of short notice and no notice major incidents that we experience on the network, which has involved kind of wiring communications into command and control structures at TfL and making sure that our organisation are putting the customer at the heart of decision makings during major incidents. So ultimately our purpose now is to make our customers feel cared for, and we're doing that by delivering ever more targeted and inclusive travel advice that helps people to make those smarter, more comfortable, greener travel choices. And a byproduct of that for our operational colleagues is the reduction of crowding and congestion on our network, which allows for smoother running. And perhaps most relevant for today, the ability to work with our project teams or third parties' project teams to help them mitigate the impacts of essential construction works that need to happen in London. Could I have the next slide, please, Liani? So because we are such a small team, we need to work out where TDM is needed and where systems, processes, and existing teams can do a very good job without us. So in order to work out what kind of project requires travel demand management, we have a categorization tool, which we use to determine which projects require us, essentially, and where we can be most effective for the customer. So we assess, we have a kind of forward view of all the works and closures that are coming up in London with a kind of everything from a few weeks to a couple of years forward view. And we assess each of those against various sets of impacts. So kind of transport and customer network impact, cumulative impacts of what else is happening in London. If you're running a particular work and event, what else is going on that might be drawing demand to the area that might cause cumulative issues, how long the work closure event is going to be on the network for, and therefore what the extended impact of that is, how much stakeholder interest there will be, and also the reputational impact to Transport for London. And in doing so, we've come up with categorization of what types of projects require travel demand management for TfL. And that's those large scale works, large scale events, major incidents such as strike, where we have very little notice, but the impact to the customer will be enormous. Those events where there is a cumulative impact, where there's lots of other things going on, etc. And then the smaller, more regular events that you see in London, where perhaps something like Wimbledon or Pride, where it's the same footprint every year, the travel advice is the same, you require less of a behaviour change overlay. So that's how we work out where we're most useful and communicate that to others internally. If I could have the next slide, please. Liani? I'm going to rattle through these because this is just a little bit of exposition. But in terms of our approach, we use the 4 A's, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. So that period of raising awareness of the disruption to come well in advance across a number of different audiences. The issuing of as targeted as possible, as inclusive as possible, travel advice in advance of the disruption, something really useful about what customers need to know and do. And then activation and ensuring that we have when all of our works and closures move to a live environment, when the work is launched or the event is happening, that we've planned for that activation from a resilience perspective and from a crisis communications perspective, and then evaluating the achievements at the end. Can I have the next slide, please, Liani? So that is a quick exposition of who we are and what we do. So I'm going to move on to the case study I wanted to bring today. Now, there were a number of different case studies I assessed for this audience, and there were some that were probably more demonstrably successful from a travel demand management perspective. I'm thinking of one on the Northern Line recently where we shut a full branch because our rail and tube networks are closed. We are planning those things years in advance, and we had the opportunity to be integrated into that planning and to do some really targeted and effective behaviour change. But the project I wanted to bring to you today is on the roads network, where the situation is slightly different and more complex. And I thought it would be a better example of real-world TDM, where we are dealing with a number of different complex challenges and a number of different audiences and partners. So this particular example is about Gallows Corner, which is the connection point between the A12 into London and the A127 out of London towards the M25, and that sits in the London Borough of Havering. It's really heavily used. It's a strategic 5-arm junction where at the surface level there's a roundabout, and there's also a bi-directional flyover, Gallows Corner flyover, which is the key strategic route into London. So essentially the flyover was in very poor condition and it was in urgent need of renewal. And I think forecasts investment needed in order to improve it. It was forecast to close from 2026 with all of the impacts for roads users that would have come alongside that, along with demolition the following year. So as a project, it was part funded by the Department for Transport and the Mayor of London, and it involved the complete renewal and replacement of all of the elements of the flyover, except for the foundations. Lots of different approaches to the project were discussed and ultimately decided that the most efficient way to go forward with the renewal was a full flyover replacement with a 10-week full closure, which is a huge demand management challenge. And in terms of the timeframes for that, we had enabling works from March 2025, and then the full closure commenced in June 2025. And during that full closure, there was still to be a through route maintained for buses and emergency vehicles only. Could I have the next slide, please? So that was the challenge. And this was our approach, which aligns with our approach to all projects. So early engagement from our project teams, from our sponsor teams, and from our operational teams is absolutely essential to us being as effective as possible. So we worked really closely with the project and network management colleagues, assessed what the broader and then more specific impacts of this work would be on customers, and developed a strategy for what customers would need to know and what they need to do in order to mitigate the impacts of that. And that includes feeding our requirements into demand modelling, understanding customer travel patterns and behaviours, and assessing against our R's, which most travel demand management professionals will be aware of. What are the opportunities for rerouting, retiming, remoding, and developed a set of objectives around that. So our overarching objective was to inform our strategic and local customers of the closure in advance, and also of what their best travel alternatives would be when the closure was in place. We also needed to encourage those making strategic journeys, so those journeys that were longer than 5 kilometres, to reroute via the M25 to the M11 and the A13. And from a local perspective, we wanted to encourage customers to remode from cars to local buses. So local buses could still pass through that junction. So could customers more effectively and more comfortably be continuing their journeys on a bus. And we had supplementary objectives around off-peak travel and protecting our bus journey times too. So once we'd worked out our approach, it meant that everybody involved, including our partners and our operational colleagues and network management colleagues, were all working to a single picture of what the impact would be. And I'm so sorry, I think we've moved on to the next slide there. Could you possibly take me back one, Liani? Perfect. Okay. Could we please go, sorry, sorry, this is entirely my fault for not being able to share the slides myself. Can you go forward one, please? Yeah, let's stay there for a minute. So we established our target audiences, so primarily drivers and our bus customers, secondary from a commercial and freight perspective, and then our stakeholders, so extensive engagement needed with delivery partners, boroughs, freight and servicing audiences, local businesses and residents, National Highway, of course. And we created a suite of channels across all audiences. So from a customer perspective, print, digital, paid for marketing, including radio and partner channels, which amplified our core messages, which were a combination of broader awareness raising and then more targeted to specific audiences who had the opportunity to change behaviours, using specific heat maps, targeted bus customer information, etc. With a particular call out here, which I'm sure is a trend we're all seeing, to those third-party planning apps, which we all know our customers use more than anything else. So how can we best use our relationships with Citymapper, with Google, etc., to have them amplify our messages and to alert on our behalf in advance and really extend our reach there. So, for example, we worked with Waze to provide an alert for anybody who planned a journey within 40 days prior to the launch, and anybody who currently or from a future perspective is planning a journey across that junction or across the local area, to provide them with a push alert to let them know what was happening and what the best travel advice was. And that meant that we had a single picture of the operational impact and then a single source of truth for our objectives, what we're trying to achieve, but also messaging, which could be shared and amplified across all of our partner channels too, which, as you'll see here, were extensive. Could I have the next slide, please, Liani? And could I have the next one, please? So from a communications and engagement perspective, as I mentioned, we used a whole suite of channels. And in terms of the efficacy, we can see that and reach, we can see that there were thousands of emails sent. I'm just going to pull out a few from this. We had 11 million impressions on our paid for marketing, which had a reach of 3.35 million. I mentioned that Waze traffic event. We had a unique website which had 80,000 unique visitors to that, and we were really heavily using the data that we'd managed to glean from our assessing impact phase to really clearly communicate via heat maps where people should expect to see the impacts of this particular closure. And I think a really telling point here is that we had communications channels were engaged with really well. But also we had a very low level of complaints coming through our customer contact centres, which was a sign that we had raised awareness and that people knew what to do around this particular closure. Could I have the next slide, please, Liani? So in terms of our monitoring summary, and you'll see at the top here that this monitoring summary is for the initial 10 weeks of the closure, which ran from June 2025. So that was the planned full closure. Unfortunately, due to issues with groundworks, both us and our partners, Essex and Suffolk Water, have suffered delays because of the issues with groundworks that are ongoing. So unfortunately for us, this closure is still ongoing, and we hope to be able to announce the opening soon. But our monitoring comes from that initial period of closure where we were really testing the travel demand management and how people responded to that. So in terms of our key and core objectives, which were to reroute long distance journeys in the way that we advised, we saw a depending on the variances from baselines, we saw 1 to 5% traffic flows increasing on the M25 as we suggested. We saw an increase in loadings through the junction on our buses. Unfortunately for London Borough of Havering, there was a dip in their customer care score, but I think that is to be expected for a closure of this scale and length. And from a comms and engagement perspective, we had really good scores for engagement, click-throughs, open rates, etc., and managing to reach 3.3 million individuals with very minimal negative customer feedback. So from our perspective, that is very successful from a monitoring perspective. Can I have the next slide, please? So as with every single project, the final phase for us is one of the core elements of TDM is that we set objectives that are measurable and we monitor those throughout the live delivery of the project. And then we use that to evaluate at the end. So as part of our evaluation of that 10-week period, we've established some really clear lessons, and this is engaging with partners and other agencies too to gather together the lessons. I think one thing is really clear, and anybody who knows the area or has seen the media coverage there, we could have done a better job of planning for the worst case scenarios of the dependencies and risks of the delivery of projects and the delays caused to us and to partners of the ground issues that we discovered, which meant the closure extended. There were some really early learnings around late notice on funding confirmation, which changed how the exact closure plan would work. And that makes things slightly more difficult for us from a travel demand management perspective, because we need to get involved as early as possible and know all of the details in order to communicate that to our customers. So we're looking at what lessons we can learn to help improve that for future works and closures. We also learned that when we become aware of delays, and when we become aware that we will not meet project deadlines, etc., more frequent status updates are needed to stakeholders and customers. So even if we're in a position where we don't know when something will reopen, it's really key from a reassurance perspective that we are updating on our progress. And so since the closure has extended further, we've been putting in place regular newsletters to let people know how we're progressing towards that reopen. In terms of what went well, we started with a really strong cross-team collaboration. So we put in place in the October before the closure occurred a project communications working group, which involved representatives from the project, representatives from our partners, all of the communications channels, in order to really consistently plan what it is we were going to say, which kept going even when the project was live, in order for us to respond and react to any changes. We had a really successful TDM plan for the initial blockade, and our advice was followed, which is always great to see. And we also experimented with the introduction of visual comms, so time-lapse and drone footage, etc., which was really highly effective in terms of selling the benefits of the pain that people are feeling for the closure, and updating people on that. So in conclusion, while this is a more complex project for us, as road projects do tend to be from a travel demand management perspective, this is a real example of how it works in practice, and how we can demonstrate the value of the practice of TDM while navigating around challenging funding positions, tight timeframes, cumulative impacts from other works, multiple partners and agencies. So this is what it looks like on a day-to-day basis for us. And we've achieved our goals of mitigating the impact of major works on our customers and stakeholders. Liani, could you skip back to the integration slide for me, please? Okay, so really key learning for us on this project was the importance of integration. I've mentioned it a few times, but in the 14 years that the new form of TDM has existed in Transport for London, we have learned and fought hard for early integration into planning with the project, where we can be most effective, where we can work alongside our project sponsors, operational colleagues, to assess impact, to feed requirements into data gathering and modelling, etc., and to make sure that we are as effective as possible in coming up with a good strategy for making very targeted behaviour change interventions around major closures. Integration with political stakeholders, network management colleagues, etc. Setting up the network of contacts that you need to share information with as early as possible, establishing those relationships was really key for Gallows, and has been for all of the other projects that we deliver. Pan mode integration. So as London Strategic Transport Authority, we always need to think from a pan mode perspective. And this was really key for Gallows, thinking about how something on the road network will affect the rest of London, and all of the other modes that are delivering transport in London, whether they belong to TfL or belong to boroughs or belong to other operators. It's thinking about the knock-on impact from a customer perspective, across modes, and it's been really important for us to think about that early, because the customer doesn't really care who's providing the service. They want a smooth and seamless journey through London. So it's absolutely inherent to every project that we need to be engaging with other transport providers for whom there will be a knock-on impact for something that we're doing. And then from a PanComms integration perspective, we sit within the customer directorate, because the outcomes of the TDM projects we deliver are customer benefits. But we also need to think about reputational messaging, stakeholder messaging, corporate communications, using partner communications to amplify. So that single PanComms view is really important, and then integrating with partners too. And an integrated approach allows us to develop that single source of truth on impact and a single source of messaging on how we're all going to communicate, which helps give clarity to all of the audiences, but also helps us from an efficacy perspective. And I think given that we're probably all seeing upwards trends in hosting events, in the need to renew assets, in major incidents on our network, we're seeing one from a weather perspective at the moment, the need for that integration and to grow and develop our TDM practice by learning from one another is going to be vital to us delivering the best response to all of those. And that's it from me.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Helen. We'll now move on to our final speaker, who is Dan Paynes, Head of External Comms at Great Western Railway. So over to you, Dan.
Thank you. I think that should work with some sharing.
Yes, we can see that. Thank you.
Lovely. Sorry. Thank you very much. So really interesting hearing the presentations beforehand, and I suppose certainly around that pan comms approach that I think I'll be talking about a little bit that Helen talked about there. And I'm Dan Paynes. I'm Head of Communications here at Great Western Railway. But I always start this stuff with a small health warning. I am the communications person on this panel. I am not the person who can model a network, calculate queue discharge rates, or tell you precisely quite how many people can clear a station in a given time, although if I'm one of them, I can certainly complain about it. So I'm not here to claim, comms is a big old panacea for all of this sort of hard operational work that happens behind the scenes that is so critical to positive outputs. But I have spent a good deal of time dealing with what happens when operational reality meets real people who are often late, often anxious, often heading to or from a major event, and all quite reasonably wanting to get home at the same time. So that's why I think, like it would seem many of you, given the subject matter of this webinar, I think communications at an early stage is so often underweighted in these conversations, and underweighted, frankly, by my colleagues rather than yours. Whenever I'm working with travel demand management specialists, they're always asking, how can we get the comms people, the public affairs people, the stakeholder people into the tent significantly earlier? Because as we know, disruption is not an operational problem. It's also a behavioural problem. It's a reputational problem, as Helen was saying earlier. And if we're being blunt about it from a railway event and venue perspective, at least, when we're talking about major events, it's a revenue problem. The operating plan often tells us what the network can handle, where the pinch points are and where the options are, but it's in those communications pieces, in the round, that pan communications approach, where you can turn that into choices customers can understand and, most importantly, act on. So that's the framing I want to bring today, I suppose. Lessons I've learned as a comms person while working with great demand management colleagues like you guys, and perhaps give you some tips and tricks about how you can get my counterparts in organizations you might be working with engaged earlier and inputting earlier. Now, I'm just going to pop to the next slide. I think Alistair and Helen's case studies were particularly positive, but I'm in comms, so I like to sort of self-flagellate. So I've got some case studies to hand, but it's significantly less positive. My introduction to major events was not through a textbook. It was through discovering that a plan can look perfectly sensible in a meeting room and feel really, really different when tens of thousands of people arrive at once. And my case study is going to be, 11 years ago now. It was the 2015 World Cup hosted in Great Britain, and for the 6 months of planning that I was involved in, significantly less grey and less beardy than I am at the moment, seemed to happen without much excitement. But the lesson I learned quite quickly was that having enough trains, staff or capacity or even adverts and communication messages on paper is not the same as being able to manage demand, because if all people arrive at the same place at the same time with the same expectation, the operation can still come under pressure. So it's this event particularly where I learned lots of my lessons from a comms perspective as to why, as an organization and as communications professionals, we needed to take travel demand management much more seriously, deal with it earlier, and most importantly, take what had previously been an operational specialism and integrate it into our commercial and corporate planning. So the structure of this presentation that I can whiz through now is based around 5 of those lessons, really. Reputation depends on how demand is managed, and that's why external comms needs to be involved from the get-go. Transport is part of the event experience, so you need to make sure that all of those stakeholders, particularly when it comes to major events, are all in the room and agreeing to a single plan. Collaboration across agencies is critical. One of the things that Helen talked about again is the ability to have those cross-agency conversations. We're in the same sort of space from an industry perspective, and those conversations do happen on a really regular basis. So, and the one that's might sit slightly strangely in this space is recognizing that actually marketing is part of travel demand management and vice versa. Ensuring that people are getting the right experience and the right advice on the day is central to that marketing function and generating and maintaining, in many cases, that revenue strand. And then taking that proactive approach from the get-go benefits both event spectators and regular passengers. So my first foray here was an understanding that demand management and reputation are about more than crowd control. That's how you tap in to an external comms person's psyche and getting them involved earlier, because poor planning or late planning can damage both the customer experience and the reputation of the operator, venue or promoter, and that adds up to pounds, shillings and pence a little bit further down the line. Those customers don't neatly separate those responsibilities in the moment they experience one single journey. So you might have a train ticket for an event, but actually the person putting on that event and the person performing at that event is just as damaged by the challenges if we collectively get that wrong. So for the Rugby World Cup, in terms of a bit of background to this lesson, we developed an app developed by the Rugby World Cup team to encourage customers to travel on early high capacity trains. That was 11 years ago. It was fairly early, and it was designed in the sort of whole idea of demand management sort of apps. So this was one of the first that was actually pulled together. And the idea is that we protected our BAU customers, encouraged customers to travel going to the World Cup games, to travel on specific trains, protecting our BAU customers while getting them to their destinations effectively. But actually, unfortunately, for that very first high-profile match, that died completely, excuse my French, on its arse. One of the 10 additional trains that we'd put on, each with a capacity for around 1,000 fans, the first 8 were entirely missed out of the app. Now, that did 2 things in practice. It gave us a false sense of security looking at those trains because they looked quiet and they looked manageable. But more fundamentally, it pushed 8,000 people onto the final 2 trains. And as you can imagine, perception becomes reality very, very quickly in those situations. So overcrowding and confusion do not just create an operational issue, they create a sense that nobody is quite in control. One of the challenges that we had at the time was that our Twitter team sat in an operational sphere rather than a communications sphere, and our responses, as you can see on this particular slide, which was like, well, we didn't really understand that there was something big going on in Wales, and I'm really sorry we've messed it up. But that in itself led to front pages on the Sun, Times, Telegraph, independent, effectively, and I'll show you one of the pictures later, that just showed, you know, horrific mismanagement of the situation, with, you know, people sleeping in luggage racks as we tried to get them through. So when you are looking to try and get your message across to my colleagues earlier, you know, recognize they will always look at these things through a reputational lens, and finding a way of talking to them in that way will always get you some early engagement. My second lesson here, and if you can see just about carefully, there is a middle-aged gentleman who's found the only refuge that he can in one of our luggage racks here. We made the mistake of separating the customer from the spectator in this particular example. And this picture really sums up the idea that the spectator's journey starts long before they even reach the venue. It starts when they decide whether to travel, even before this picture, when to leave, what route to use, and what level of hassle they're prepared to accept. And it doesn't end when the event starts. So making sure that you've got those waypoints and those journey points built in, you know, along the way, thinking beyond the end result, the venue, even the middle result, the mode of transport, and understanding why people are choosing that should be integral to that event experience and will be critical to getting that message across. And once again, these are languages that communications professionals will prick their ears up and think that they can help you with in a way that they might not do with other sort of messages. And then, yeah, the key to this is convincing marketing colleagues, communications colleagues, that actually demand management and marketing are two parts of the same coin. And this might in some areas be possibly the slightly more provocative part of my argument, and the risk where I risk being sort of politely disagreed with from some of you specialists in the room. But I don't mean that marketing is the whole of travel demand management. Clearly it's not. But I do think if you talk about it in the same breath and recognise, you know, as Helen quite rightly pointed out, you know, that this is part of how you deal with your customers and how you give them the experience that they've paid for, you can make sure that you're not just selling tickets. You can use that same piece of thinking to use many of the same levers, right? So through your marketing, you can use that timing, choice, and motivation to make sure that you're doing all of those things that marketing colleagues will find important, and therefore get involved with at an earlier date. So we know that well-planned campaign doesn't sell tickets, and we need to have those conversations with marketing teams in that same breath. The important discipline to start with is the operating reality, capacity constraints and pinch points, but then, yeah, using those marketing techniques from the very beginning to decide what behavior we need to influence, because there's no use having a really clear idea in the travel demand management team where you need people to go, if that's not being considered when you're looking at some of the other above the market line marketing activity that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And the fourth lesson is really about working as one. Yeah, when we had the challenges with the Rugby World Cup, we needed to pull people through really quickly and find a solution. And the only way we could deliver that, a solution, and turn around where we got to with that particular event, was by embracing others. Yeah, it was the rail and bus operators, the highway authorities, the event organisers, the venue, and the local authorities that all came together within the space of about 48 hours of the original cock-up, who came together to actually make sure that we were able to reset, replan, work out where things had gone wrong and what we needed to do collectively to solve that as a solution. So it's not always about every organisation using identical words, using the same poster template, but it is about giving customers advice that's consistent, timely, and credible, and making sure that there is one plan that covers travel demand management, communications and marketing, rather than for the whole event, rather than 3 plans potentially for all of those organizations that don't actually come together, because that disruption doesn't respect organizational boundaries, and our comms can't either. And then finally, which is fundamentally where we lost our traction with my memories of the Rugby World Cup, is that the final lesson is to stay ahead of demand. Proactive planning beats reactive firefighting, and plan for every one of those scenarios that could possibly come up. And external comms people love looking at those sorts of things. They love looking at what those risks might be reputationally and preparing in advance where those problems are. They're also really good at looking at plans and seeing where they're weak reputationally, so that they can help make sure that the actions that we are taking, anticipating those demands and those asks from a customer and where they might fall down because of operational constraints. They will love to get involved with that at a very early stage and help you make the right decisions. And that gives the opportunity to move from generic warnings to specific useful advice in a playbook that is probably that thick, 99% of which you will never, ever use, but making sure that you've got that in a proactive way rather than waiting for that reactive need to take place. And that's the real value of getting communications embedded in early, and gives us a much better chance of moving demand for meeting that point. So I'm not, to close, I suppose, suggesting a good communications plan can rescue a poor operating plan. It can't. But a good operating plan can be undermined really quite quickly if customers don't understand it, don't trust it, or see reasons to change that behavior. So that demand management works best, in my view, when the operating plan is translated into clear, credible, and timely choices that people can understand and act on. And that means bringing comms in early enough to shape behavior. And that means having those conversations and encouraging, in my experience, those people to get involved in something that they might not think is necessarily a key piece of work for them, because it's so operational in the guts of it. But if we get that right, and we're not just responding to disruption, we're reducing the pressure it creates for customers, operators, and partners. And that makes sure that we're in the right place reputationally, that makes sure that we're in the right place from a revenue perspective, and it makes sure that we're in the right place when we're looking after our customers. And that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Certainly recognise some of those TDM and marketing debates there. I've had those with comms colleagues throughout my career, but yeah, really useful tips and tricks, and yeah, certainly taken some notes there. Okay, so we move into the Q&A part of the webinar this afternoon. So just a reminder to please pop your questions into the YouTube chat, and we've already had some come through, which is brilliant. And to open this part of the webinar, I'd just like to touch on the context in which we're having this conversation today, and a bit of a backdrop really in terms of the recent publication of the Integrated National Transport Strategy. And many of us working in this space will have noted the absence of, in focus of that coordinated management of disruption across modes. And I think the omission of that really, reinforces the importance of today's discussion and prompts, an important question for us all around what more could we be doing to strengthen and improve our approach in this area. So on to the first question that I'd like to open with to the panel, is really thinking around that sort of modal response, and the opposite of that, having a multimodal response. And Alistair, it was really interesting, if I come to you first, that National Highways have certainly been on a bit of a journey as an organisation here, a step change in way of working over the recent years. And now as an organisation, you are looking across modes. And we often deal with disruption in silos. So I just wondered how much of the challenge is structural versus cultural, and to what extent are we currently still set up to manage disruption effectively across modes, or, are we still largely within them?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are challenges within system and culture. I think I was reflecting actually on that from within organisations. I think it's absolutely paramount that you do have such divisions like ICIT, which are within customer. Helen talked about in customer as well, where you almost have an agnostic part of an organisation that is representing the customer through any major project delivery, and actually can challenge, because I think a lot of our pressures are on delivery, and the biggest pressure is on, you have this budget to deliver these schemes over this time period. And sometimes that can become, the key driver that you look at, and almost the impact of that on customer and community could easily be neglected. That's why I think it's really important to have almost like a check and challenge perspective from a customer section that does say, okay, have you adequately considered how we're going to consider not just those using the motorway, for example, but those from an end-to-end journey of transport enabling perspective about those overall journeys that are trying to be undertaken. So I think there's a real opportunity here, and I think one, it's about having within organisations that ability to take a step back and represent the needs of the customers, the people who are actually using the rail network, the road network, and understanding from that perspective of where they're trying to get to and how they need to continue those everyday journeys where possible. And so being able to take that modal agnostic approach, I think as well, advanced consideration. We heard it from the comms perspective, but also from the planning perspective. I think National Highways has had historic examples of this, where we are looking siloed at what we do on our network and what the scheme will do for just on our network. And I think there is an evolution. There's a process going on within National Highways where we do take more of a corridor network-based planning focus, and I think it's great to see that. I'm seeing that happen proactively now within certain regions, whereas unfortunately, I think Dan touched on this point really clearly. Often these types of boards are established because of some horrendous event that's happened, and it's a reactive. We have a number of examples in the past of that, where things happen from a reactive basis, and that's great if you've got the enthusiasm and the individuals on board, but what you could find over time is that enthusiasm wanes as those issues become less prevalent and people think, oh, we've nailed it now, let's move on to another challenge. You have to have that proactive planning consistently there through the life cycle of an organisation, quite frankly, not just a project. So I think there is a space there, and I think there's wider recognition. I think the industry in general is moving away from it's our user on this road or on this train, more to a customer, community, economy, sort of transport enabling perspective. And I think that is really well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alistair. Just wanted to come to you on that point, Helen. As you mentioned, TfL as a transport authority, multimodal is very much what you do. Very well versed in those multimodal responses. I just wondered if you had any reflections on, to what extent, this is happening, or, if things need to actually be moved forward.
It's a really interesting one, because we do have the benefit of having that pan-mode view as a strategic transport authority. So the onus is on us to think of that wider modal impact. And we are certainly really good at doing that now. So, for example, we're kind of joining modal planning, and we have a single kind of TfL control center from a network management perspective. So we're really moving towards that. But certainly reflections from the early days of travel demand management projects were that because we have the customer view, we were really often the people joining the dots. And playing back to the different modal planning functions, the impact of the disruption that they are planning on other parts of Transport for London. And often we were the advocate for a single view. And I think that can sometimes be our role in influencing the people who are doing the planning to be thinking about every type of customer that could be impacted by the work or the disruption that they're planning, and to think of those modal elements and it transferring from our responsibility with that customer view to the people doing the planning, because I think our customer absolutely expects this of us. They expect something seamless. They see TfL and Network Rail as interchangeable, and they see the roads management situation as interchangeable. So they are absolutely expecting to hear from us in a multimodal way, and that should be the driver for how we structure, how we plan those things. And it needs to be more than kind of perfunctory, I'm doing this here, that means you can't do this. It needs to be I'm doing this here, how does that affect your customer question? And we need to be influencing that into planning functions.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's that holistic view, isn't it? And yes, it's that joining the dots and almost like the mediator here around actually, we're all wanting the same things here. We need to be pulling in the same direction. And Dan, effectively, you're working within a mode, and your presentation discussed a lot around, as I mentioned, the sort of tips and tricks here. Is there any reflections that you wanted to add on this?
I'm a comms person, so I think words matter. So I think there's a nice little trick for this when we're looking at stuff, because I think Alistair's right. I think there's a much better view of how we're impacting customers. I think sometimes every organization will come to the table thinking that they represent not the customer, but our customer. So if you're not careful, you'll get right. Actually, this is mine. This is mine. I'm here to champion only mine. And if my customer is the one who is least impacted, then that's great. Actually, if you just change that sentence to just talk more generically about the customer, whether they are frankly driving on the tube, flying, on the train, or even recognizing that the people that we are taking are often traveling to an event, right? To enjoy something, to see something, their customers there as well. And once you just tweak that, and once you maybe talk to the different partners in that frame set in that way, you do get a slightly different response. So I would always say, look, how do we take our individual immediate wants of our customers and the ease to our systems, and recognize that transport is a systemic model, and it needs a systemic approach. And if you're not pulling on all of those strings at the same time and seeking, unfortunately, what sounds like a compromise but is the most effective result, then you're not going to get that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. I just wanted to go to a question in the chat from Tom Van Buren. Good to have you on the webinar today, Tom. And it's really thinking about that network impact. So Tom has a modelling question for yourself, Helen, around, did you use TfL's models to show customers what would happen if TfL did not replace the flyover, and what the impact would be if they respond as suggested as an incentive to change their behaviour? Great question.
Such a great question. That's a really great question. And a tricky one we struggle with a lot, particularly around supporting sort of asset renewal projects, where the customer may not see or feel the benefits of what you've done, but nevertheless you've assured the track or the road, etc., for many years to come, and it's safer and it will work more effectively, but they won't necessarily see the benefits of that. So explaining the negative is sometimes difficult. I think we do tend to take the more sort of positive approach of selling those benefits. This will be better, it will last longer, it will be safer, it will reduce ongoing disruption for you in the future. But I do think it's worth considering in kind of treating customers like adults and explaining what the consequences of us not renewing things will be. But we'll obviously have to balance that from a reputational perspective without being too alarming or alarmist in explaining why it is what we're doing. But it's a really good question, and one we struggle with a lot.
Great, thanks, Helen. I just wanted to divert the conversation to this top-down versus sort of bottom-up approach, and to what extent, do we need national guidance versus local flexibility in managing disruption? And thinking about, if this were something that we were to push for, what it should include and not include. And Helen, I wanted to come to you on this one. And as you described, 2012 was the real birth of managing demand and TDM as we know it today. And TfL have lots of experience and learnings over that time that you've built. So welcome your views as a strategic transport authority, who have really good successes and a bit of a blueprint for this at that regional level. On your thoughts, to what extent do we need this national guidance?
I think it's really key. I think it is the only way that we can grow by learning from one another. So from our perspective, we've made it really pivotal to the growth of our programme. So we established something called the TDM Forum for London, where we meet with, it's a rail focus with Network Rail, all of the TOCs, RDG, etc., on a bi-monthly basis to share best practice. And we get so much out of that sharing of information with people who have both a national and local focus. And we've set up something called the City Regional Forum, which we host alongside TFGM, Transport for Greater Manchester, and Transport for West Midlands, where we are looking at the practice of TDM, what we can learn from one another. And I think as we hit on in the kind of the response to the multimodal questions, that ability to share lessons, share case studies, benchmark best practice, in order to grow our own programs in a kind of collaborative and integrated way, it's just going to be really key for us moving forward. We are quite unique functions. Not everybody understands who we are or what we do when you say TDM, as I've experienced many times over the last decade. And it would be great for particularly from a positive case study perspective, if we could be using those collectively to sell the benefits of demand management and early integration into construction planning, etc. And we'll do that as a force collectively much more effectively than we would do individually.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. And to yourself, Alistair, you're an organisation, already working at that sort of national level. Just wondered what your thoughts were on that in terms of that national guidance approach.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on, I think there needs to be a blend of flexibility to adapt to local circumstances, but as a framework to help organisations and systems think through this and actually how and where we should look at travel demand management and what the opportunities are. I think that's the sort of thing that could be quite helpful, and create a sort of a parity within different organisations and mechanisms by which we can all be looking through the same lens. I think that would be very helpful for organisations, I feel, because I think within an organisation, I think it's really important to have the types of functions that are there to sort of really improve that consideration of customer perspective. But I think, there's an opportunity here for sort of systems and organisational level thinking to bring us more closely together, more aligned in thinking about the end result on customers.
Brilliant. And Dan, thoughts?
I suppose I'm the smallest organisation here, so I might be looking for a different balance. Right, look, you need that framework, you need that best practice framework, because you need to almost teach people what to expect from a customer perspective, right? So there needs to be some familiarity around that, but there also needs to be recognition that the solutions on the ground and how that is interpreted are always going to be different. So I think framework and guidance are 100% the absolutely the right sort of terms to use. And how do we work together? How do we what's the common terminology? How do we work out what the severity levels might be? What are the minimum standards? But there's always got to be room for us to sort of have a play, and find out how things might work. I mean, I found things out because I followed the guidance at the time and had to make something up that was very different very quickly and skirt those rules. Indeed, I'm happy for Helen to sort of give me a slap around the face and correct me, but I suspect 2012 was a time where the underground did things and transport did things very differently, broke a mold and moved out of it. So I think, yeah, you've got to find a way of that national guidance that will help us all, but recognise that there are always exceptions to that rule, and allow people on the ground, to have those conversations and make the decisions that are in the right interests for the customers, our customers.
Our customers, indeed, yes.
Not our customers.
Not our customers.
Not just ours.
So, whilst I've got you, Dan, there's been a couple of questions that have been posted in the chat from Steve. So he has noted that sporting authorities often don't help with late afternoon kickoffs, e.g. the FA at Wembley. But he commented that, yeah, he was amazed that you could find the 8 extra trains to put on. And yeah, just as background, Steve, I think has worked in the rail industry previously. So yeah, has got good sort of industry insight there. So yeah, I think that was more of a comment than a question.
If anyone's got any suggestions as to how we persuade people to move those things, that would be great. But equally, it's a really useful point to illustrate the customer, our customer point, right? If we don't exist to take people from their homes to fun stuff, whether that's family or friends or a concert or a play or whatever it might be, if that is not our job as transport professionals, I don't know what is. And so it is on us and our operational colleagues to find the right solution to that. Some of that might be moving things by half an hour, but not everything can happen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is precisely when we would really like it to happen. And whilst it frustrates the living hell out of me, I also can understand why everyone isn't necessarily marching to the tune, because we're there to deliver for those customers as well as our own.
Yeah, and there's a comment that's come through on the chat around customer, isn't always very high on the checklist for a project construction or delivery manager. So yeah, just underscores the importance of really growing that awareness across the industry and suppliers. I just want to briefly touch on something else that's come through, and we've spoken a lot today on the webinar around the plan disruption. And there's a question around how do we improve things for people, not knowing what is going on. So very much that reactive. Appreciate, this could be a whole webinar in itself, but just wondered if the panel had any quick thoughts to share on that. So, for example, stuck on a motorway behind a crash, or on a train where there's been a signal failure or wires down. Just thinking about that in terms of disruption. Don't know if any of the panel had any thoughts or wanted to come in on that in particular.
I'm happy to come in on this, because for us we've evolved to include this within our TDM practice, that kind of resilience and crisis response, because it is essentially what we do for planned disruption in a much more truncated way. So working out what's going on, what's the picture of the impact, and really quickly communicating it to the customer. So for us, it's the same thing, but with a hell of a lot more challenges. The predominant one being that in Journey, by far the best channels to reach people are those real-time communications channels. So status and planning tools, which from a road perspective is really limited. So roads disruption it's quite hard to get those live dynamic messages about how people should travel differently to people on roads, but we can be sharing them with third parties who can amplify them for us. So to my mind, this is another facet or another arm of TDM that we should all be considering and perhaps thinking about as part of a framework, because it's essentially the same practice with a much shorter time frame of bridging that gap between the operation and the customer.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. I'm conscious of time and really keen to get to the last question around, this whole, topic around national policy and lobbying. So I'd like to ask each of the panel, what should this group, practitioners and the wider industry be advocating for as a next step at a national level? As I mentioned, there was not much mention in the national transport strategy around this topic. So we're going to just come to each of you as sort of a one takeaway around what we should be doing as a collective force. So Dan, I'll come to you first.
Oh, okay. So I think if there was one piece of, if there was one thing that I would encourage things to be included is actually how do we better share live data across, rail, highways, bus, to enable us to make better decisions on the ground here, because I think understanding how you can make decisions for the customer in real time is one of the biggest challenges that I think we've all got here. So that I think would be that would be top. I think looking at common digital tools to show customers those real end-to-end options. I very quickly sort of ditched everything but Citymapper, because I know, right, and it does such a good job of telling me exactly where I need to go, regardless of the mode of transport itself. So I think those two would be key in terms of practical terms. And then actually, how do we work together for those regular joint exercises around those unplanned pieces of disruption, severe weather, infrastructure failure, leisure events. How do we get together at a national level maybe to look at those jointly and gather some best practice there?
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. And Alistair?
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to lobby so much in my role for particular avenues, but I think that the framework point that is really important. I think every organisation is very busy on its own performance metrics and delivering what it needs to achieve for its mode and dare I say its customers in inverted commas. I think therefore a framework that takes a step back from above that and actually looks across different modes is really important, I think, for moving forward and having something in place that helps organisations better work together, use the same language. Just one last point I want, and this is probably really pertinent to point around incidents in live time. We've got to factor in this really strong point around comms. Trust is everything in this space, because it makes us nervous to do things differently around messaging. Trust is the thing, and therefore, when it comes to live breakdowns, we as an organisation are very acutely aware. If we start bringing out messages saying this road will probably be open in 20 minutes, you will be, and it doesn't, you erode that trust in the messages you're trying to convey. So it's really important that undermining all this is a responsibility around trust. And if we are looking to move people in different ways, we've got to have the data, the intelligence to tell us that what we're advocating is the right output mechanism for our end users. And I think trust can be a real blocker sometimes to doing something innovative, because it moves you into an uncomfortable area. And I go back to the survey result, for example, that I said on the Sinister Island, where it'd be great to move some of that traffic that we potentially have around Manchester onto other modes, but customers are telling us they're not really interested in other modes. So we have to present trust in, give customers trust in what we do around managing demand and managing travel.
Can I change my answer to that one, please?
Yes, we will allow it, Dan. And lastly, Helen.
I might change my answer to that one too. I'm going to be really brief to avoid repetition, but I do think that framework is going to be really key. That kind of cross collaboration at a national level to put those kind of minimum standards in place, which, as Dan so rightly points out, we can all be kind of creative and bespoke around, as long as we know kind of what's expected and can really clearly articulate that to other people. I think the framework is going to be key for that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Helen. And I think that brings us to the conclusion of our Q&A session and into final remarks. And our 90 minutes this afternoon has absolutely flown by. And yes, so thank you to all of our speakers and panelists. It's been really great conversation. So I guess the $1 million question, what comes next? And I think what's emerging from the conversation here this afternoon is, there is something here around the national approach. And I think, the importance of retaining that ability and agency at a local level. But actually there could definitely be a space for partners to, really draw upon and utilise a best practice multimodal national approach. Looking at what what works, that, you know, really consolidating together lessons learned, case studies, benchmarking to really encourage that cross collaboration. And I think from my perspective as well, you know, the national guidance, you know, it recognises there's different levels of maturity here across partners, across regions, and certainly that would bring, you know, some consistency, standardisation, and bring that wider benefit to the industry. So we don't want the conversation to end today. We want to keep this going. So the intention is, from a TPS and a CILT point of view, that there will be, you know, some publication and comms coming out on this to really encourage us to keep the conversation going. And as I mentioned, you know, there is the potential here to lobby government for that more joined up approach to guidance. And we are very happy to work with other professional bodies and partners in this space to really amplify our professional voice as well. So hopefully that brings together what's been a great 90 minutes spent discussing this. Again, once again, thank you to our panelists and speakers. It's been a really great session, and thank you also to the organisers at TPS and CILT that have helped make today possible and helped with all of our logistics. So with that, brilliant. Bang on time, 2 o'clock. And yeah, so I'll bring that to a close there. And thank you all for joining us on what is a very warm afternoon, and we really do appreciate